All right, let's just jump right into it. Welcome to today's Explainer. Today we're unpacking a really specific and honestly highly provocative perspective on American politics. We're looking at a recent commentary by Josh Hammer, who's a Newsweek senior editor-at-large. In a recent broadcast, he laid out this incredibly stark claim that the Democratic Party is actively working to deconstruct the U.S. constitutional system. Now look, whether you lean left, right, or somewhere completely in the middle, understanding the arguments that are shaping our political discourse right now is absolutely vital. And just to be super clear, we aren't here to endorse this view today. We are just here to dissect it. So here's our roadmap for the Explainer. First, we'll look at what Hammer calls the century-long war. Then we'll track 4 transformative presidents. From there, we'll unpack the competing philosophies at play, examine the administrative state, and finally review some proposed constitutional changes. Let's get to it.
All right, starting us off, let's look at Part 1, the century-long war.
The scale of the claim Hammer is making here is just massive. He literally outlines a, quote, century-plus long war by the Democratic Party against the United States Constitution. He's explicitly framing the core objectives of the Democratic Party as being fundamentally opposed to the whole foundational framework of the U.S. government.
So, we aren't just talking about a polite disagreement over tax rates here. This perspective argues that the underlying philosophies of our 2 major parties have become completely irreconcilable. It's like oil and water. And to back this up, Hammer points to a pretty heavy hitter, Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas. He quotes Justice Thomas, who he actually describes as the single greatest living American, who states bluntly, progressivism is completely incompatible with the U.S. Constitution. That really sets the stage, right? One major party, according to this view, is basically running an operating system that simply cannot be installed on the founders' hardware. Okay, moving on to Part 2, let's talk about these 4 transformative presidents. Hammer maps out a very distinct lineage of America's 4 great transformative progressive presidents. The origin point? He says it all starts with Woodrow Wilson. From Wilson, the ideology jumps to Franklin D. Roosevelt, then it accelerates under Lyndon B. Johnson, and finally reaches its 4th stage with Barack Obama. The argument here is that with each of these administrations, the country drifted further and further away from the original constitutional map. So you're probably wondering, where does Joe Biden fit into all this? Well, interestingly enough, Hammer doesn't actually view Biden's presidency as a new era at all. Instead, it's categorized as a direct continuation. He explicitly labels it as Barack Obama's 3rd term. So in this analytical framework, the Biden administration is really just the latest vehicle for that exact same progressive trajectory that kicked off over a century ago. Which brings us to Section 3, the competing political philosophies. Right at the core of this whole debate are 2 fundamentally opposing worldviews. On one side, you have the American founders' vision, which was heavily influenced by James Madison. And on the other side, a progressive ideology that Hammer argues is rooted not in American tradition, but actually in continental European philosophy, specifically the Germanic ideas of George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. To really grasp the founders' side of this, we have to look at Madison's famous words in Federalist 51. He wrote, "Men are not angels. Ambition must be made to counteract ambition." It's a philosophy built on profound caution, really. It assumes that humans are inherently flawed, and therefore requires a strict and, sometimes frustrating system of checks and balances to prevent tyranny.
Now let's flip the coin. The progressive mindset, at least as is described in this commentary, views the framer's caution as entirely outdated. Instead of checking ambition, this European-style philosophy assumes society is now quote-unquote enlightened. It relies on educated elites and bureaucrats who supposedly know better, leaving the public with basically one job: bend the knee and obey their mandates.
That leads right into Part 4, the administrative state.
So how does that elite-driven philosophy actually look in practice? Well, according to Hammer, it gives rise to the administrative state. He describes this as an unaccountable 4th branch of government. Basically, power is stripped away from the representatives that you and I actually elect, and it's handed over to unelected bureaucrats who are operating entirely outside of our traditional constitutional checks. And he argues this directly violates another core Madisonian concept, the problem of faction from Federalist 10. The founders totally expected competing factions. They actually designed a system to manage that exact friction. But Hammer argues that modern progressives hate that friction. They don't want to deal with it. They simply want their enlightened policies rubber-stamped without any constitutional resistance getting in the way. And finally, we hit Section 5, proposed constitutional changes. Hammer argues that this is no longer just some abstract theoretical debate. The push to bypass checks and balances, he says it's actively happening right now.
The commentary points to open discussions we're seeing about packing the Supreme Court and even abolishing the U.S. Senate and the Electoral College. The ultimate goal, according to his analysis, is erasing structural resistance entirely.
The conclusion he draws here is incredibly sharp. These proposed structural changes aren't viewed as well-meaning, good-faith policy shifts. No, in Hammer's own words, all they care about is power. He paints this vivid picture of a political movement that's trying to win by simply dismantling the rules of the game itself.
Which leaves us with a pretty heavy, provocative question to consider as we wrap up today. If this analysis holds true, can a constitutional system actually survive when its foundational checks and balances are viewed by a major political faction as obstacles to be destroyed rather than necessary safeguards? I mean, it's a fundamental question about the structural integrity of American politics. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and remember to keep questioning what you hear.